Let me go ahead and get started, and Mr. Horsford is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and the ranking member, and want to join with your remarks earlier in thanking particularly Commissioner Davis for the hard work of the first responders. You performed exemplary, and it was an example of how we need our first responders to react. And to the entire city of Boston and the Boston Police Department, as the chairman and the ranking members have already said, thank you for your service. And without a doubt, the rapid response by the Boston's first responders really made a significant difference. I want to point out something in your testimony. You stated that the federal government provided invaluable assistance both in helping us prepare for and respond to this tragic event. Preparedness training provided through UASI and other federal funding set a framework for multiple jurisdictions to work seamlessly with one another in a highly effective manner. In studies on terrorist targets, the RAND Corporation has stated that Las Vegas, the district that I partly represent, stands out in having a high proportion of high likelihood targets compared to the nation as a whole. That the same study also reports that the unique composition of hotels, casinos, and skyscrapers increases the overall attack probability in Las Vegas relative to other cities in the same likelihood tier. Yet, in my home state of Nevada, our urban area security initiative faces reduced funding because of flaws in the relative risk profile model that has inexplicably dropped Las Vegas's ranking as a likely terrorist target. So my question is, have you seen the same reduced level of funding in Boston over the last couple of years? And if so, what has that been, and how are you grappling with it?
Thank you, Congressman. Sheriff Gillespie and I have met frequently on this challenge, and we traveled to the Middle East this past July and visited police officials in Jordan, in Israel, and in the Palestinian Authority. And we had direct conversations about the threats that they are dealing with and how they respond to them. And that just cemented in my mind, and I'm sure in Sheriff Gillespie's mind, the need for us to be prepared. UASI is simply the best vehicle that we have at the local level to make that happen. And we have not received significant cutbacks. There have been some cutbacks, but we were facing the same threat several years ago and overcame it. I can tell you that I'm convinced now, after responding to this incident, that if we had not trained through the UASI process, they funded joint terrorism training preparation and something called Urban Shield. And if it was not for those preparations, there would be more people who had died in these attacks. It is critical that we maintain that funding to urban areas. This is not a frivolous expenditure. It's something that I have seen work, and it also gives us, and we're the people on the ground. We know what we don't have, and we know what we need to get, and the less bureaucracy around that, the better off for us, and that's what UASI has done for us.
Thank you, and thank you for recognizing Sharon Gillespie, and I was meeting with him and our assistant sheriff at our counterterrorism center just last week, where they shared with me the fact that in our case we went from a peak of $9 million of UEC funding to under $2 million recently, and so that's a 70% reduction in 5 years. It's a huge impact at a time when the threat appears to be increasing. And so what are your recommendations to us as policymakers at the federal level, any of the witnesses, on how we need to prioritize these funds in order to support your work as first responders or other leaders in this regard?
Just briefly, I'll just add to my comments by saying that the priorities that you funded work very well for us, and we should continue that. But that added component of giving us the ability to meet with foreign police and military leaders who are dealing with this threat and understand what they're going through in their countries. As I said, we're an international city. That knowledge, I traveled with PERF, Police Executive Research Forum, who funded that trip and the conversation I had with the people in London about the way they responded to the tube bombings drove this investigation. I can't tell you how invaluable it is. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. I know it's a long day for you, but I really appreciate you being here. I'd like to, at the outset, to recognize there were some victims of the Boston bombing from Charlotte, North Carolina, the Groves family, and just want to, again, reiterate what this committee said before, that our thoughts and prayers are with the victims and their families. There are many that are still on a long road to recovery, and we're going to keep them in our thoughts and prayers throughout this process. I guess I will start with Commissioner Davis. One of my lines of question I'd like to go down, it has to do with the type of information sharing when it comes to top secret information. I assume that you and the Undersecretary have clearance, a certain level of clearance, and maybe the folks in the Joint Terrorism Task Force have a top secret clearance and are able to see the same information DHS and other agencies have. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir. Yes.
Do you feel like that that you have an adequate access to that information through the folks in the JTTC and you and your staff?
Yes, I've been assured by the special agents in charge that whenever information comes to their attention that affects my community, that I'll get that information, myself and the mayor as well. Mayor Menino was briefed in on any threat that manifests itself. And that has worked over the years. We've got information from them on various things that were evolving.
Well, and from your perspective, do you feel like the mechanisms are in place to get top secret information to your department through the state agencies, the dissemination of information? Do we have the proper mechanisms in place to get the information you need on threats?
The mechanisms are there. We have top secret and secret computer systems that we have access to in our Boston Regional Intelligence Center. We have rooms that allow that to happen. We frequently talk about issues that come up, and so I think that the mechanisms are in place. Yes, I do.
Great. Well, I guess the other layer of that then would be when you've got this top secret threat information, it's shared from a federal agency to your department, but then you've got your patrol officers out there, and you want them looking and eyes open, taking that information from top secret level to a lower level of secrecy that could be disseminated on the patrol level. Is that something that you're equipped to handle? Is that something is that become an issue? How have you dealt with that in the past?
Each case is different, Congressman, and we have had debates as to what goes out and when it goes out. And so from my perspective, I err on the side of pushing information out quickly. There are always deliberations about that. There are always conversations about what is appropriate to get out to a wider audience. But the protection of my officers and the protection of my citizens is my driving motivation to get as much information out as quickly as possible.
Well, I think that was clearly evidenced in this situation. While the world was watching, you and your department did an exemplary job, and I really appreciate, on behalf of the American people, what you've done.
That's very kind of you, sir.
Well, I guess the essence of my question is, does the Department of Homeland Security need to do more to help you sort of develop the information and take it from a top secret level to the information that can be disseminated on a patrol level? Do we need to look at ways to do a better job on the federal level to help you process or package that information so it can be distributed to your officers? Is there a need there for that type of assistance?
My belief is that in the 10 years since 9/11, these mechanisms, as you stated, have been put in place, and they work well. However, I think that in this area, like we do in a lot of other areas, there should be a constant process of improvement. We should be always examining what we're doing and moving it to the next level. We have incredible new tools that have just developed in the last few years with computers and communications equipment that have not been factored in appropriately. And so let me just say briefly on the radio and communication side of it. Okay, so when we talk about street level communication, what I can get out to my offices and who's talking to who, we have not moved forward as quickly as we should in that particular area, and I think that has to be looked at. But when you start there and you move up the chain as to who talks to who, when, and what information is available, it all has to be examined all the time. I think this incident is going to be a good case study.
Well, thank you for your answers, and I agree, and I think that this committee's approach should be and is to look at lessons learned, look at moving forward, how we can improve, and again, try to be right 1,000% of the time is the goal. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yeah, thank you for that. I unfortunately have to step out for a minute, so I'm going to turn the gavel over to a very experienced individual, Mr. King, who chaired the committee for 6 years, correct? So, but before I do that, let me just say, Senator, thank you so much for your advice, counsel, Undersecretary, Professor, Commissioner Davis. Your presence here today is really means a lot to all of us. In your testimony and to the people of Boston, we support you in your efforts. And let me also say thank you to the mayor for allowing you to come here today to appear before this committee. So thank you very much.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our witnesses. I welcome this opportunity to highlight the brave heroes, the citizens of Boston, who ran into the blast zone to help the victims affected by the blast, but also to highlight the brave men and women of law enforcement and the emergency responders who hunted, captured, and killed the 2 individuals responsible for this. Serving on this committee for me is also special because I was a former prosecutor, but also a congressional intern in Washington, D.C. when September 11th happened. And what happened in Boston reminded me that the threats facing our country are still very real. And while there is information to be learned from the intelligence community as far as what they knew before the blast went off, it's clear now that we face new emerging threats from lone, radicalized wolves who can use readily accessible materials that you can get off the internet to wreak havoc and do damage in mass groups. And that's what I think we are here to seek to protect against and talk about today. But there are a lot of answers to come from the community, but I want to talk about what happened once the blast went off and what our emergency responders did, and examine to what degree we can make sure that you and other agencies are more prepared. I also know that because of the sequester, Homeland Security funding could be threatened in the future. And we have talked a lot about the Urban Areas Security Initiative. I come from Alameda County, where I was a prosecutor, and it was the Alameda County Sheriff's Office that developed Urban Shield. And they've been doing that for a number of years under the leadership of Sheriff Greg Ahern. And I understand that former Assistant Sheriff Jim Baker actually went out to Boston back in December and led part of the efforts for Boston Urban Shield. So I was hoping you could tell me just a little bit about what lessons were learned in Boston from your Urban Shield program, and what would be threatened if you did not have that funding in the future.
Certainly, thank you, Congressman. Sheriff Baker and the other individuals who developed Urban Shield did us an incredible service. We sent teams out to Alameda County twice, and after the second time, we talked about them moving the training to the East Coast so that we could incorporate people throughout New England. And that's exactly what happened. We've had we've had two of these exercises now that have allowed us to really examine what we would do in the case of a mass casualty event like we saw in Boston, and we included everyone in this training. It wasn't it sort of centered around SWAT teams, but then they brought in hazardous materials teams. Kurt and his team were incredibly helpful in making this happen and bringing everybody into the fold on this whole exercise. One of the things that popped up in our first exercise was that our communications with the fire department was not sufficient. And so we were able to change our radio system to correct that. And after the blast happened, that was helpful to us. That interoperability made a difference in our ability to respond to the marathon.
And would reduced funding for that program threaten your ability to respond if an attack were to occur again?
Without a doubt, without question, if funds are cut to these programs, we're not going to know what we don't know. It's only when you exercise these events that you find out that you have a gap in your systems, and if you find that out after the incident occurs, lives are at stake.
And you mentioned that you were able to work with international law enforcement agencies. Were you able to work with forces from Israel and anti-terror departments from Israel?
Yes, the Israeli military and police services have been very helpful to us, sending people over to train us. As a matter of fact, the tactic that Sergeant Conley used in opening the bags up, the cut and tag tactic, was taught to us by the Israelis.
And again, Chair, having been here when September 11th happened, I remember how dark of a place Washington became, but I know under your leadership and also Senator Lieberman, under your leadership, we were able to invest in a department in Homeland Security, and I think what we saw after the bombs went off, the coordinated efforts among local, state, and federal law enforcement is what was envisioned as far as how we would respond to an attack. So I want to thank you, Senator, and also you, Chair, for your work in this area.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Utah, Mr. Stewart, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the witnesses, thank you for being here today. As with all of us, we are appreciative of that. A very quick comment or two before I get in that. Mr. Lieberman, you mentioned in your opening comments about the need for bipartisanship as we approach this. You have been a great example of that through your career, and many of us are grateful for that. Commissioner Davis, if I were a Hollywood casting director and I needed a strong persona of a leader, I think I would look to someone like you, so thank you for that. In considering this case, I think many of us want to break it down chronologically. Maybe phase 1 to phase 2. Phase 1 being what happened up till that fateful morning, April 15th. What is it that took place prior to the bombing? And then the second phase is what happened subsequent to that. The investigation, the apprehension, the pursuit of the individuals, and then what we're doing now. And that's looking back on lessons learned or what we could have done better. And it seems to me that there were a lot of things in phase 1 and phase 2 that were done right. This wasn't a catastrophic failure in the sense that there were many things that were done right, but there were clearly some meaningful failures, or we wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't be having this conversation. And when you look at some of the considerations in phase 1, how were these individuals radicalized? Who assisted them in their radicalization? Who assisted them? Did anyone assist them in the bombing itself and preparations for it? Were they receiving logistical or other kinds of support? And did we miss any warning signs? And of course, some of those questions have been discussed this morning, and much more conversation as we go forward. But Mr. Hudson, my friend here, mentioned looking forward, and that's what I'd like to direct now, and that is, I think that we can agree that somewhere in our nation right now, there are individuals who would like to do exactly the same thing again. And in fact, they're probably preparing to do that again. Would that be outrageous to make that claim, or would you agree with that? There's someone out there doing that. We all agree on that. Yes, thank you. And knowing that there must be individuals who are in some phase of planning a similar event, maybe several months away or maybe longer, have we done anything now? Have we looked at lessons learned and said, okay, we need to continue the investigation, we understand that, but have we done or changed anything now in order to make it more difficult or to stop those efforts from going forward? In any of you, I'd love your
Well, I'll start it
response to
briefly.
that.
Thanks for the question. Actually, I think this committee is doing that now by raising the questions that have been raised today. And to go back to what you were kind enough to say at the beginning, I'm really encouraged by what I take to be the totally nonpartisan approach in the committee to finding out what went wrong here. That's the first thing we can do, because you're absolutely right. There's at least one other group of people, and probably more, who are beginning to think about carrying out a terrorist attack against our country. That's been the record of the last 11, 12 years since 9/11.
And see, Mr. Lieberman, if I could, I don't mean to disagree with you because I don't, but if I could just take that a little further. We all want to continue the investigation, but we don't want to wait until the investigation is over to do things that we can do now. And that's my point. There must be something that we've done that said, look, there's an immediacy to this. We can't wait for the hearings to conclude. Let's do this now. I'm wondering, can any of you share things saying this is what we've changed in the last 3 weeks that have made this less likely to happen?
If I can offer a couple observations. You are absolutely right. Starting at the local level, regional, state, Monday evening, April 15th, just hours after the bombing, a number of us already were talking about what does this mean going forward? What does this mean in terms of our next very large event, July 4th, where we have some 800,000 people in the Boston area. So we are already looking forward, even as we're also looking back. I commend this committee. I commend the media for all the attention. We can certainly hope that one of the lessons our communities have learned by watching this, 24/7 and living through this, watching it on television, is that we need the community's participation. I hope that message is out there now, and others have talked about it here today. The importance of the public picking up those warning signs, see something, say something. I know that at the local or regional, state levels in Massachusetts, we are already looking to increase our engagement with a number of communities, including our local Muslim communities. There already was a good program in place, but we need to do better. We are looking forward, as I said, to July 4th. We have, in a collaboration between city and state, we have reached out and engaged a number of security experts around the country so that we can take new looks at prevention, protection going forward. The good news story here was the response, the recovery. Yeah. We need to focus more on prevention and protection. We will.
And again, thank you for that. My time has expired. If I could just end with this. Again, there were many things done right, but there were some meaningful failures. And please, let's not wait for an investigation to complete 6 months ago to do what we can now to implement some changes that would make this more difficult. Thank you again to the witnesses, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Barber, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses. Really exceptional testimony here today. And many questions have been raised by my colleagues about what we can do to prevent a reoccurrence, and we have to ask and answer those questions. And I know that we'll be having subsequent hearings to examine those issues. What I want to focus on today is what happened the day of the bombing and then the weeks or the days following, because I think we can learn a lot, as the gentleman just asked, about what we can do better, and certainly we can need to expedite that information. I just want to commend both Commissioner Davis and Undersecretary Schwartz for an incredible response, an efficient and effective response to this great tragedy. I do know that other communities, including my own, have faced similar situations, not exactly a bombing in the case of Tucson, but certainly similar in terms of what was required to respond effectively. And I also want to thank you, Commissioner Davis, for bringing the photographs. You know, when we get into discussion about a tragedy like this, we sometimes actually forget that there's a very personal human tragedy that comes out of this. I know that the people in Tucson are still grieving the loss of their loved ones, and many people from that shooting are still dealing with the change in their lives. So I really appreciate seeing the faces of the good people that were lost that day. It reminds us why our work is so important. And, you know, I remember seeing photographs of the 6 people who died in Tucson. When you put those photographs up, it took me back to that terrible day and the subsequent weeks. I was in Boston last weekend for Congressman Giffords Award, and I saw the memorial near the finish line. And I saw everywhere I went, signs on buses and everywhere else, Boston Strong. And what I felt and saw in Boston was exactly what I felt and saw in Tucson. We will not be defined by these kinds of tragedies. We will be defined by how we respond. And I commend you and all of the other good people in Boston and in the state for that. I want to ask a couple of questions about where we are today. And I want to first of all, thank Senator Lieberman for coming, and I want to ask this question of you, Senator. In your testimony, you pointed out that a holistic approach is the most effective way to solve or to deal with the spread of violent Islamic extremism and the radicalization process that is going on right now, as we've heard, in our country. And I firmly believe that law enforcement, in addition to all of the citizens of our community, are really critical to that effort. Senator, as you know, before you left the Senate, we were dealing with this sequestration issue. And I'd like to ask your opinion about how you believe sequestration has impacted on our efforts to both prevent as well as to respond to a tragedy like this in the future. I'm particularly interested in what parts of the Department of Homeland Security, or at that matter, any other budget or federal agency, you would give priority to as we're trying to figure out how to deal with sequestration. We've given the Department of Homeland Security some flexibility, and they're going to come back to us with reprogramming requests. What would you prioritize in light of what happened in Boston and what we know, unfortunately, may well happen again?
Thanks, Congressman. Not an easy question, because a lot of the programs that are now being funded and cut back a little bit are critically important, such as the programs to aid state and local law enforcement. But if you look at the record of the 12 years now since 9/11, which I recited briefly at the beginning, the only attempted attacks against us that have succeeded were all carried out by homegrown terrorists. And those are the toughest cases. And there's where you require really the whole of society that I talked about. And that requires, in my opinion, not just FBI, but particularly state and local law enforcement outreaching to the community, engaging the community, particularly in this case the Muslim American community. This is, in a sense, unconventional, but a lot of the communities that we're going to be asked to do this are as strapped or more strapped for funds in the federal government. And so if we want to go where the problem seems to be most serious right now, this ideology of violent Islamist extremism among homegrown radicals, I'd say that we don't want to cut back in our support of state and local law enforcement, because they're where it is. Mr. Chairman, if I may, on a point of personal privilege, this congressman, after the tragedy we had in Connecticut in Newtown, called me in a very private call, based on the pain he went through in Arizona. It was really a noble and selfless thing. It was until I'm about to shoot off my mouth. It was a totally private act which nobody ever would have known about. But I'm glad to have this opportunity publicly to thank you for that. It meant a lot to me.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Someone yields back. Thank you, Senator. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of a founding member of this committee, Congressman Shays from Connecticut. Congressman Chris Shays, who was a former colleague of Senator Lieberman. Chris, we miss you. Okay. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your service in this regard in this incident, and of course to your service to your community and your country. With that, my My questions primarily would be to Senator Lieberman and Professor Southers. And I know some of it's been covered a little bit by the acting chairman at this point, but I can't help but just reiterate some names to you. Richard Reed, Jose Padilla, Ayman Ferris, the Virginia Jihad Network, Assam Hamoud, the Lackawanna Six, the Fort Dix Six Blotters, Nidal Hassan, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and Mohammed Atta. Now, Senator Lieberman, in your opening statement and subsequent questions, I think the American people would agree with you, and I think that you get it, so to speak. But for the professor in particular, I think those names are probably familiar to you. What would you say they have in common?
I would say obviously they have in common their religion and if you will, extremist Muslim ideology.
Okay, thank you. And that's my concern. You know, in the 5th century BC, Sun Tzu said, "Know thy enemy and know thyself." And as a military officer, of course, it served me well. And based on research, at least 50 publicly known radical Islamist-inspired terror plots targeting the United States have been foiled since 9/11. Did you know, Professor, that 30 of the FBI's 31 most wanted terrorists are radical Islamists?
As a number, no, I did not.
Okay, so my concern, is, among other things, is that you're a professor and I listened to your testimony, and it seems like there is a reluctance to acknowledge who the face and who our enemy is by name. And maybe we're having a definitional problem here, but, you know, and let me read the president's recent statement. The president stated that the dangers to our homeland now come from self-radicalized individuals who, because of whatever warped, twisted ideas they may have, may decide to carry out an attack. Where do you suppose these ideas come from, Professor?
They could come from a variety of extremist ideologies, and your facts are correct. There have been a number of individuals indicted since 9/11. Specifically, 207 individuals have been indicted since 9/11 in the United States that have, as you've mentioned, if we will, an al-Qaeda ideology. 5% of those people for roles in violent incidents. There have been 139 right-wing militants indicted since 9/11, where just under 50% of those people were engaged in violent attacks before arrest. So my point and my testimony was one of, although the facts are correct with regards to the extremist ideology they share, that we understand that radicalization is not monopolized by any particular ideology or religion or race.
But by and large, would you agree that the greatest propensity, by far, is radical Islam? Not any other one, just that one.
I would agree that based on the facts we have today, absolutely, that would support that.
Okay, so with that, Senator Lieberman, the YouTube account under Tamerlan's, by the way, and his name is The Sword of Islam, showed that he had viewed multiple Russian language videos on radical Islam and even compiled playlists of jihadi videos. Should we and should the authorities have been concerned?
Well, of course, and part of your investigation and the executive branch investigation has to be, why weren't they? Why didn't they? Did they know that? I'm afraid that they didn't know that Tamerlan had put up his own YouTube channel and was broadcasting all those violent Islamist extremist videos. But obviously that's one of the places where the system broke down.
So let me ask you this question, Senator. Why do you think, I know you can't answer for him, but why do you think this administration is unwilling to use the term radical Islam to describe these acts of terror? And this is really important because investigations and our national mood about how we deal with this, I think, is expressed here. What is gained by the president's refusal to appropriately describe jihad as expressed by radical Islamist extremists as their motivation for attacking the United States and other free nations?
Well, I don't know. In other words, this is a debate that I had over the years during my time in the Senate, and particularly with this administration. For all the reasons you say, you got to know your enemy and call it what it is. Particularly now, there's a danger if you think that the enemy is Al Qaeda and you observe that Bin Laden is killed and Central Al Qaeda is on the run. You may be lured into believing that the war is over, but there is this ideology, violent Islamist extremism, which in fact is not over, it's spreading. And it's not just spreading to enough people here to make us worry at home, but it's what's happening in Syria and Mali and Yemen and and Pakistan and Afghanistan and Chechnya and Dagestan. In America. So I don't get it. I presume it's because of a sensitivity that if you use the term Islam or Muslim at all with relationship to violence or extremism or terrorism, it will do offense to Muslims. But I'm privileged to know a lot of my fellow Americans who are Muslim. They're law-abiding. They're patriotic. They have nothing to do with these criminals and terrorists, and I don't think it's fair to them. I don't think it's fair to them not to single these people out. Maybe the words we're using are not right, but somebody else said this. I'll just repeat it. It's too short and too simple, but unfortunately it does bear some truth, which is that obviously most Muslims are not terrorists, but the sad fact is today that most terrorists that we're dealing with in America are inspired by this violent Islamic extremist ideology. And you got to recognize that to deal with it.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. I recognize my friend from New Jersey, Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first start out with thanking Commissioner Davis and Undersecretary Schwartz for the incredible job that was done in Boston by your organizations along with the federal government. It truly shows that the system works and that we have the capability to, when an event occurs, finalize it very quickly. I think it's extraordinary that this whole incident was wrapped up in a week. It's absolutely incredible in my view. I thought this would be a situation that would drag on for quite some time, but to have an incident happen at the beginning of the week and to have it completed and the bad guys found in a week, I think says a lot about the system that we have in place. There were naturally some issues, and they've been exhausted here today, I think. But I'd like to ask Commissioner Davis. The administration has proposed to consolidate the Homeland Security grant programs, including UASI, the State Homeland Security Grant Program, into one funding pool. Under the proposal, it is unclear whether grantees would be required to dedicate 25% of the grant awards to law enforcement, terrorism, and terrorism prevention activities. Based on the way you've been able to utilize those resources, do you have concerns about the proposed grant consolidation?
I certainly owe a debt of gratitude to President Obama and to Secretary Napolitano, but I have to say that I think that plan is going to be detrimental to the further security of our city. I have to say that the UASI program has been extremely helpful and made a difference, and I think it should continue as it is.
Yes, we've had great experience with that in northern Jersey, where I come from, Newark, New Jersey, which has major airport and port and chemical installations. That the UASI grant has been instrumental in us being able to do the types of things we need to do in order to make sure that that area is safe. So with your concern, I'm very concerned as well. The other thing that I have, since joining the committee, have gotten involved in is the whole question around interoperability. And, the response efforts, following the bombing demonstrated successes in interoperability between agencies, disciplines, and jurisdictions. The Commonwealth received, as you well know, $3.11 million from the Interoperable Emergency Communications Grant between FY08 and FY10. The last year, that program received allocated funding. How did these funds from the grant help contribute to your interoperability?
Well, thank you for the question. As I mentioned in my opening statement, interoperability has been a huge success story in Massachusetts and was a great story on April 15th and the days that followed. Through a variety of grant funds, some you mentioned, there was the PSEC money that came to the Commonwealth as well. A number of years ago, we created a statewide interoperability executive committee that took control of and charge over all of the Homeland Security funds that came into the Commonwealth. And that group, which is comprised of people from all over the state, developed local, regional, and statewide interoperability plans, and then invested in those plans. So if you fast forward over the last number of years to where we were on April 15th, an hour before the bombing, as we were supporting the Boston Marathon, there were public safety agencies, local, state, and federal, across 8 cities and towns that were all communicating. Tactical units were on their own channels. Command level people were on their own channels. Voice communication was working. And that remained true through the week. But perhaps more importantly, if this were to happen or a similar type no-notice event happens tomorrow, we have the capability across the state by just flipping, pushing buttons and flipping switches to make sure that that level of interoperability is established. And I think it's fair to say that none of this would have happened without the Homeland Security grant streams that have been coming into the Commonwealth.
May I just add that there's one fly in the ointment here, which is the T-band. And I know we're getting into sort of complicated things that I might not be the best person to explain, but if we lose T-band, as is scheduled to happen in the next 6 or 7 years, according to the FCC rules, virtually every police department in the metropolitan area of Boston, from 495 in, will be adversely affected by that. We need to revisit that, and we need to talk about these new technologies that are out there that will help us with interoperability. This has all been put together with funding that worked for us, but because of some of the broadband issues that are being discussed right now and the T-band that we are scheduled to lose, we're going to have problems.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. It is
acting chairman.
I'm trying to promote acting chairman. We need to be cognizant of these type of issues moving forward. We see how well it worked in Boston, and to cut that funding, I think, would be detrimental to this nation's security moving forward. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with the gentleman, and obviously Northern New Jersey and New York are really one unit, so thank you. Before I close the hearing, I just have several questions for Senator Lieberman and Commissioner Davis, I guess under the heading of lessons learned and going forward. Senator Lieberman, when the FBI did its investigation of the, based on the tip from the Russians, to determine whether or not the older brother was radicalized, they did not discuss it with the imam or anyone in the mosque. My understanding is that's because of a change in DOJ guidelines in the last several years, that to go to a mosque, they have to get approval from a committee in Washington, I believe. Do you think, in view of the fact that if a person is going to be radicalized as a Muslim, you should go to his house of worship to see whether or not the people in that community would have felt that he had been radicalized?
I do. I don't know exactly what happened here, but this is why I raised the question about the Department of Justice guidelines for the FBI, because, again, looking back, unusual to get this kind of tip from Russian intelligence. What was the nature of the investigation that the FBI did? It sounds to me like but we don't know, so you'll ask them. They talked to Tamerlan Chernayev, they talked to his mother, they had some sporadic surveillance around his house. But as far as I can tell, they didn't talk to anybody else. And, talk about the whole of society. If you really wanted to check somebody out, before you close the file, which is what they did, you have to talk to friends, neighbors, and people in their house of worship. And that's not, to me, that's not a violation of, the right, freedom of religion or anything else. It's putting first the safety of the people of Boston in this case, including everybody who was a member of the mosque.
Also, Senator, this is an issue that maybe affects the House more than the Senate, but I think the last count there was anywhere between 85 and 100 committees and subcommittees and commissions that claim some jurisdiction over Homeland Security. Do you think, in view of the problems that we saw or encountered over, in this particular case, as far as maybe one agency not knowing what the other is doing, that the time has come to further consolidate within Congress jurisdiction over Homeland Security rather than having it spread over so many different committees and subcommittees?
Well, I sure hope so. I mean, it's great to be back with you, Congressman King. We work so closely together, and we always will on these matters. And you remember, after 9/11, after the 9/11 Commission report, the Kane-Hamilton report, amazingly, we worked together across party lines, both chambers of White House. We got most of their recommendations adopted, at least in part, except one. The one that reformed Congress and limited the number of committees having oversight of Homeland Security, because that was Congress protecting its own turf. And so what's the significance of that? First off, it takes time from the Department of Homeland Security that they really ought to be spending back at the office protecting our Homeland Security. It also makes the work of Congress less effective in combating the threats to our security. So I hope that one of the things that may come out, this is probably a quixotic hope, but is that come out of the tragedy in Boston is that Congress, again, take a look at itself, not just the administrative branch of our government, and figure out how we can better organize to deal with Homeland Defense.
Thank you, Senator. I have a question for Commissioner Davis. You said that the mechanisms are in place for the FBI to notify you when there's a threat. Do you think we should consider lowering the threshold as to what a threat is? For instance, when they were told by the Russians to look into the older brother, if that should happen in the future, wouldn't it make sense to speak to the local police department to see whether or not they know anything on him, and perhaps ask the local police to keep an eye on him as they go forward?
That certainly is an area that deserves very close scrutiny, Congressman. I believe that our relationship has improved dramatically in the last 10 years. But when you're dealing with intelligence between nations, that's still difficult to access. And there are reasons for that, and I understand them. But when information is out there that affects the safety of my community, I need to know that.
Thank you, Commissioner. And even if, they wouldn't have to tell you it even came from the Russians. They could just say, we received a tip from someone that perhaps he's been radicalized. Could you keep an eye on him?
Right, and I've received secret and top secret information in the last 10 years. But I think that where that sort of bar is that everybody gets notified on, that has to be looked at as to whether it's in the right place.
Because I think after this attack, a point was made. There was no chatter. There was no international intelligence coming. And I think that's going to be the wave of the future. These are going to be attacks that are under the radar screen. And it's more important than ever the local police be involved, because no one has a better feel for the community than the local police.
And we have 600,000 people in local police departments across the nation, which is a force multiplier for the federal agencies.
Right. Thank you. Well, let me thank all the witnesses. Professor, I didn't welcome you back. I know you testified before the committee 5 years ago, I guess it was. It's great to have you back. Mr. Schwartz, it's great to have you here. Really added a lot. And Commissioner Davis, the whole country is looking at you for the outstanding job that you did. And Senator Lieberman, what can I say? An old friend and a real patriot. And one of the few people in politics who never lets you down. So, Senator Lieberman, thank you. I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions to the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. The hearing record will be held open for 10 days. Let me just, on behalf of myself and the entire committee, thank Chairman McCall for holding this hearing at the first